All right, and then here, give me a couple seconds, and then should be good. Oh, funny thing. I think you're the person that recommended this mic to me. The one that you're using is the one I'm using as
Oh
well.
yeah, I like it. It's a good one,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, I think we're good now. Okay. Just confirm. Yep, recording. And then I'll just check because sometimes when you're like live streaming a couple different places, I just want to make sure it worked. So go to my channel, live. Okay, perfect. All right, and now I'm gonna start recording as well. Record. Okay. Hey everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is so great to get back on the podcast game. Actually, funny enough, I have a treat for you guys. Amber Dybert was actually one of the coaches that I hired. This is about a year ago, and thank you so much, Amber. You've helped me be able to conquer some of my imposter syndrome. Like I know I had a lot of self-doubt, a lot. I mean, I'm definitely like I go through waves, right? But I if I was to bottom line what I got from working with you is just I feel like you really helped me like believe in myself, like love myself more, have more confidence, be able to trust my intuition, and just be able to step into my power. So I'm so excited to have
Oh
you
my
on the
gosh, that's the best
podcast.
compliment I've gotten all for a year. Thank you so much. I'm so
Oh,
honored.
yeah, it's been a pleasure. So just to give context, so Amber and I met through Brandon Fluharty's community, which I'm still part of. So that community is called Hustle Less, Make More. So Brandon is also another beautiful soul, and you're one of the guest speakers. So it's been a privilege to get to know you. And what Amber does is she coaches enterprise sellers that are, making pretty decent money, right? But you not only do you help them perform better, right? But you also help them be able to um, get rid of their disempowering beliefs and help them create a more empowering narrative so that they're able to not only have like better balance in life, but just be able to step into what makes them unique. So this is going to be a treat for everyone who's listening. And we're going to discuss imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk a little bit more about like what is imposter syndrome, like, and how do we go, what are the steps that we take to overcome some of these self-limiting beliefs? And I know you have a framework that, we've been working together closely, so I'm sure you'll share a little bit more about that. But excited to have you on the show.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to talk about imposter syndrome. I love anytime I can get on this soapbox. It's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. So like I think from the outside, obviously, it looks like you have a beautiful house and family and everything, right? But it didn't always start off that way, right? Would you share a little bit more about your origin story and what led you
Totally.
to have imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. So my background, I grew up one of six kids, so in a family of eight, and we were living in poverty. We had maybe $12,000 a year to go around as a family of eight. I also was
Mhm.
homeschooled. I also didn't graduate high school. I did end up graduating from college. Um, and just all these things. And so then fast forward 10 years into my career, maybe 6 years into my career, I was living downtown San Francisco. I was working for a tech startup. We reached unicorn status. I was a manager for the first time. I was making six figures for the first time, which from coming from my background was basically like $1 million. And
Yeah.
I was surrounded at this fast growth tech startup. I was surrounded by people who'd gone to Ivy League schools. And I
Hmm.
felt so much imposter syndrome. I was like, people are going to find out that I'm not supposed to be here. Like, they're going to find out that I'm actually this poor kid from a blue collar town. I'm
Huh.
actually a nobody and like I'm not supposed to be here. They're going to find out it was a terrible idea to
Hmm.
promote me. Just
Huh.
massive imposter syndrome. And I remember at the time looking around at people around me and thinking like it's got to just be something in my DNA. I guess I'm just not confident like other people are.
Hmm.
They just have something in their DNA that makes them more confident and I don't have that. And now I know that that
Hmm.
is not the case at all. There's nothing in you that makes you less confident than others. And we can talk more about like what actually creates that confidence. But I want to point
Hmm.
out that a key factor of imposter syndrome is feeling like you're the odd one out. So many of my clients that I
Hmm.
work with, they might feel like the odd one out for different reasons. It might be that you look different than everybody in your in your team. You're the only one that looks your way, or you're the only one of your gender, or the only one of your orientation on your team. Or maybe
Mm,
you have a different background than everybody else. So many of my sellers believe that there's a typical sales background of like starting as an SDR, working your way up into enterprise. And they think that like because they didn't follow that, they're atypical and they don't fit in. And I just,
mm.
to me, there is no typical way to get into sales. There's no degree in sales. Like, however you got into sales is the right way to get into sales. But so the one key piece of imposter syndrome is feeling like you're the odd one out for some reason or another. And for me, it was my background. It was like I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I went to a state school. I was homeschooled. I didn't
Mm.
graduate high school. Like all these limiting beliefs that I had.
And I'm sure in the Bay Area is also very competitive as well,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I work in New York City for most of my career, and similarly, yeah, a lot of folks from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and in some ways, I think it's shifted. Like folks like yourself and Brandon, who also has a similar background, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, $12,000 with that many kids, like that's crazy. I
Wild,
can't even
right?
imagine. That's
Yeah. And being
so,
home with your kids all the time. I'm always like, why would my mom choose to keep her kids home when there's free childcare out there?
huh.
Yeah, it's wild.
But and being homeschooled, that is different as well, right? Like that's not your typical path. But it I do
Mm-hmm.
notice a lot of folks I meet that were homeschooled are a little bit different, not in a bad way, right? But just different, right? Like just how
Mm-hmm.
you're raised and just some of the lessons and um so what was that like? Like do you think some of it was like self-inflicting or do you think some of it was you actually did get a lot of heat from other people that were like, you're homeschooled? Like that's so weird.
No, it was, and for me, it was more like they're gonna find out that I'm poor. They're gonna find out that like I don't belong in San Francisco making six figures. Like this feels so unusual to me because my identity isn't somebody who is successful. Like, and this is another common thing in imposter syndrome is you downplay your achievements. You discount all the work that you did to get there. Like I worked my butt off to get where I was, but and yet there's this feeling of like I don't deserve it somehow. Like they're gonna
Mm,
find out that like I'm not worthy of this or something.
mm,
Nobody ever called me out. Nobody ever was like, yeah, you probably shouldn't be here. Like
mm,
everybody, and that's so common for so many of my clients. Like if other people were describing you, they would describe you so amazingly well. And if
mm,
you describe yourself, you're like discounting everything that you're doing and
mm.
like downplaying everything that you're doing. So there was never a
Oh,
moment that like gave me any data as to like, nope, you're not qualified for this. It was
huh.
just that internal like nagging that like felt really awful.
And do you still feel that way? Because obviously you've coached some of the most successful, like if not the most successful, like the cream of the crop essentially now,
Hmm.
right? So do you still have days where you do feel like, am I like kind of qualified to coach these millionaires? Like
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah.
all the time. But it doesn't bother me at all anymore. And I'll get into that. But it's interesting because imposter syndrome kind of shows up in three different flavors. And there's a little bit of a misconception. I love that people are talking about imposter syndrome now. It's kind of getting buzzwordy. It's almost like
Mm.
annoying now that people are talking about it. But I do
Yeah.
love that there's actually a conversation about it and it's not like hidden in the shadows anymore. But
Yeah.
there's kind of a misconception about what imposter syndrome actually is. So, what imposter syndrome is not is there are some people, myself included, who have a nagging feeling that's persistent across different areas of their life that they're not good enough, that they don't deserve it, that they're not worthy. This is beliefs that they are learned in childhood and they've carried them with them into their adulthood, into the workplace, into their family life, into their friendships. And so if it's a pervasive feeling of a lack of self-esteem, that's something that you absolutely should address with a therapist. Therapists are
Mm,
qualified to help you with that, overcome those limiting beliefs. What imposter syndrome is it's a temporary feeling and it comes in three different flavors. The first flavor is you feel like a fraud. You feel like people are going to find out that you're making all of this up and they're going to like put the spotlight on you and be like, "We found you out. Like you're out of here."
mm,
The second flavor of imposter syndrome is feeling like you just got lucky. You were just in the right place
mm,
at the right time. The people who put you in this position were temporarily incompetent, didn't know what they were doing, and like gave you the opportunity, but they didn't know the full story. And I, like, as a caveat, this always goes alongside with like, I feel like I'm surrounded by people who are so much smarter than me.
Hmm.
And yet your brain believes that they were stupid enough to put you in the position. How can they be super smart and also incompetent at the same time? So
Hmm.
that's flavor number two. Flavor number one, feeling like a fraud. Flavor number two, feeling like you just got lucky. And then flavor number three is downplaying all your achievements. You believe that anybody could have done what you did to get there. You're not anything special. It's not that big of a deal what you accomplished. My favorite example of
Hmm.
this is a guy who got a PhD in rocket science. But it was like, oh, anybody could have done it. I'm not that special. And we all look at
Wow.
that, we're like, no way. But we look at ourselves and we're like, but for reals, anybody could have done what I did. And my
Uh,
counter to that one is always, yes, maybe people could have done what you did, but hardly anybody would have done what you did.
hmm.
That's the difference.
Wow, many layers to unpack here, and all resonates very deeply
Yeah.
with me. So,
Yeah.
so
But so I
the
think like it's so interesting hearing your story, and you're such a great example of this. The other thing that people don't understand about imposter syndrome is that it actually increases the higher up in an organization you get. So the CEO is a lot more
Mm,
likely to feel imposter syndrome than like a brand new
hmm,
college grad that has their first job.
mm,
But we all have this misconception that like somehow when I get hired in an organization or get more experience, then like I won't feel imposter syndrome anymore.
hmm.
But you're such a good example of this. And I just want to like normalize how normal imposter syndrome is because all of the top performers that I've worked with feel imposter syndrome. Like you keep
Yeah.
mentioning Brandon. Brandon was my client back in 2019 and he had
Mm,
imposter syndrome and he's shared this, so I feel okay sharing it, but he didn't graduate college. And so then
right.
he's sitting across the table from Fortune 50 CEOs and there's a McKinsey consultant on the other side that has an Harvard MBA and he's like, "Who am I to be telling them what
Hmm,
to do with their business?"
hmm,
And once we cleared that up and got rid of that imposter syndrome, then he went and closed his first seven-figure year.
hmm,
But so people think like there's no way I can be a high performer and feel this way. And there's
hmm,
evidence of so many people like yourself, like Brandon, that like, yes, you can absolutely be the top performer and still feel like crap sometimes. And that's okay.
hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. It's the higher up, actually, it's even more, right? Like even me just starting my own business, it's like I have even more now, right? Because it's
Yes.
like and starting two businesses in the same year, right? It's like
Wow.
so
Yeah.
I have plenty of it. So yeah, that man, this is there's so many topics that we can go into. But I love what you said about like getting lucky. I definitely
Yes.
feel that way. And in some ways there's some gratitude and humility around that too. Like I do feel very lucky, you
Mm-hmm.
know? But if like but I can't be lucky like 15 years in a row. Like it's
No.
like at some point I have to own like, hey, like Davidson, maybe you put a lot of sweat equity. Maybe you did work, read more
Yes.
books and whatever it took to get here. So
It's really helpful to make an actual list, like get out a sheet of paper and make a list of your accomplishments and
yeah.
write down what did you actually do to get where you are? Because so many of us discount all the hard work that we put in, but when you look at it on
Mm.
paper, you're like, "Oh yeah, actually I do deserve this." Like I did a, I'm a little unique in that I love reading nonfiction business books, but like that all that work and all that time I put in like got me to where I am.
So if you were to make that list today, like what would be some of those highlights that you're most proud of?
I mean, it's going from poverty to a six-figure income. Like that alone is so unusual. It's so like it's so I don't know. I think I've discounted it for a long time of like, oh, well, that's what I had to do. But I didn't have to do
Mm,
that. There's so many other examples of people who started out in my situation and didn't have such a great outcome. So, yeah, for me, like that is something that I'm really trying to not minimize and really try to like
mm,
appreciate in myself and like the resilience that it takes to push yourself and
mm.
grow and continue to learn and build your skills so that you can be more marketable in the market.
And I'm sure, do you have friends that are from that life, like when you were much younger, who are kind of stuck in that
Yeah.
cycle you're
Yeah.
seeing?
Yeah. My 20-year high school reunion is this year. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to go back. It's gonna be really sad. Like, I don't know if I want to see that, but it would be interesting to
Yeah.
see like what a different trajectory I've been able to create for myself. And nobody gave me that. That's the interesting thing.
Mm,
Like, it's not like I had a dad that was like was super well connected in business. Like, I didn't.
mm,
I created all of that for myself.
hmm. And do you notice like the folks that you're attracting are similar that come from more adversity or who also have parents that don't have like a ton of connections? Like are you attracting that type of
Um,
um
I don't, that's interesting. That's a super interesting question. And I don't know that that is it so much, but I think it's the story of feeling like you don't belong that I attract a
yeah.
lot of people that resonate with that story of like, oh,
Hmm.
yeah, I get that because of XYZ. Like, I didn't graduate from college, or I didn't follow a
Hmm.
typical sales background. I was an engineer and then I moved into sales, or I was in recruiting and I moved into sales. Like,
Hmm.
I don't belong here. So I think it's people that resonate with that story of feeling like you don't belong that are attracted.
Oh, and I'll never forget when you said this, but you mentioned that a lot of your female clients always ask you like, "Oh, do guys get this like self-doubt?" This
Yes.
yeah, and I was like, "Oh yeah, like that's such an interesting topic."
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Anytime, there's so many times that I'm talking, because I work one on one with my clients. I'm always trying to get them in groups together so they can hear each other, but nobody wants to share about imposter syndrome. But so
uh
I hear about it all the time. Like, I know how
huh,
normal this is, but the other person's like, "Ooh, I got this secret to share with you." Like, sometimes I feel like an imposter, and I'm like, "It's totally fine. Like, that's
hmm,
expected." But it's so
yeah,
interesting to me when I hear the women and they're like, "I'm sure that your male clients never talk about this or never deal with
hmm,
this." And I'm like, if only you knew.
hmm,
It is so normal. And that is another interesting point. So the term imposter syndrome came out of some research done in, I think it was the 70s. And the researchers named it imposter syndrome because they actually saw this phenomenon as being really prevalent in professional women. But they now know like it spans genders and demographics and whatever.
huh,
But interestingly enough, the people who named it imposter syndrome later said they wish they would have named it the imposter effect because it
oh,
is not a diagnosable mental illness.
hmm,
It's not actually a problem that you have, it's a passing effect that you gain. And the reason it's a passing effect is because, is it okay if I get into like more of like why you have imposter syndrome?
yeah, this is great. Thank you.
So the reason that they say it's an effect is because imposter syndrome only shows up if you've achieved your next big success. And I
Yeah.
always tell people this, and they're always like, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm not a success. I'm like, no, listen, if you were complacent in your career and you're not growing at all, you won't feel imposter syndrome. I was
Hmm,
actually talking to a friend at my son's school, and the wife was like, I feel so much imposter syndrome all the time. And her husband was like, I never feel imposter syndrome. Like, I don't know what her problem is. And I asked him, I was like, how long
uh,
have you been in your job? He's like, 9 years. And I was like, when was the last time you got promoted? He's like, 9 years ago. So like
hmm,
that's why you
hmm,
haven't grown, you're not challenging yourself. Whereas she's in a new position, she's learning new things. Imposter
hmm,
syndrome only shows up when you're in a growth phase. And it's temporary because you only feel imposter syndrome when you're trying to learn that new skill. So I always think about when my son was 5, we got a tall basketball hoop. And he and I went outside and we're shooting baskets. And I like make a bunch of baskets because they're like eye level to me, but to him, it's like so tall. He
aw,
shot the basketball twice. And then he was like, I'm no good at this. I'm never going to be
aw,
any good at this.
huh,
And he's comparing his 2 times of shooting a basket to my 30
hmm,
plus years of experience shooting baskets.
yeah,
And he did it twice and just did what we all do. It was like, I don't think I'm cut out for this. I
hmm,
tried it and I'm really bad at it. And it's so
hmm,
interesting because you and I can see, like, no, all you have to do is just keep going. Like, of course, you're not good when you begin, but we all
hmm,
have that same fallacy for ourselves of thinking, like, I tried it and I'm no good at it. So I'm just not cut out for it. When
hmm,
really, all you have to do is just keep putting in the repetitions to learn that skill. And then the
yeah,
imposter syndrome is going to go away. And I know this
hmm,
because there's things that are early in your career, like the first time you cold called was terrifying and you felt like an imposter. And the first time you did a discovery call or the first time you did a demo was terrifying. But then
hmm,
you did it hundreds of times and now you can do it in your sleep. It's not a thing anymore.
hmm. Yeah, that's deep. I like that. And the growth phase component of it, right? It's more specifically, right? Like, because you're right, there
Mhm.
are some people who, are more like in their comfort, like more often. Um, so I mean, it's hard to quantify, but do you feel like even with women and men, it's equal amount of imposter effect, would you say? Or do you think it's more prevalent in women?
I do think it's equal. And I think that there are different reasons behind it. Like there's different reasons why they might feel like the odd one out. Like women in sales feel
Mm.
like the odd one out because there's just not that many women. It's a very
Yeah.
masculine sales cycle. They're trying to like redefine it as a way that fits for them.
Mm.
And for men, it could be something about their background, it could be something about their experience. So I think it's for different reasons, but I actually think
Mm.
that they experience the same amounts of imposter syndrome. And if
Mm.
anybody comes to me and says, I felt imposter syndrome my entire career, it's definitely just a problem that I have. Without knowing anything else about them, I know that their career trajectory has been hockey stick growth. They've just
Okay.
consistently been in growth. So, like, been promoted quickly, 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 and like been in
Huh.
new growth phases very quickly. And so, to them, they
Uh,
see I always have imposter syndrome. And to me, I see,
mm,
well, you had imposter syndrome about this, but then it ended. And then you
mm,
had imposter syndrome about something new, and then it
mm.
ended. And then you had imposter syndrome about something else, and it ended. And I know that you've
Yeah.
grown more quickly than probably your peers have.
That, that's such a good reframe because I would say I would classify myself as one of those people who always feels like imposter.
Hmm.
But to your point, like I also grew up poor and government assistance and food stamps and free lunch, right? So yeah, I agree because I do think where I started was just very, very much like lower in a lot of these different skills.
Hmm.
So it does feel like every book, every podcast, every venture, it's like I feel like but it's like, but at least now I know I'm doing it purposely, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm
Yes.
choosing to like start my own business or start a mastermind or whatever, right? It's not like I
Hmm.
was forced to, but it does feel like I'm always like, man, like why do I put myself through the ringer all the time?
Yes. But you and I have like a chip on our shoulder. Like we've got to prove ourselves. Like we got to show like we want to like we know that we have potential in ourselves and we want to show that. And so we do end up feeling a lot of imposter syndrome because we have a long way to grow. But also, I would argue that like how far we've come is pretty mind-boggling considering where we
Hmm.
started.
Yeah, and I like how you were able to own that too, right? Because even me, like just saying like the poverty thing, I'm like, oh, like people are probably so bored of hearing this story, like so I don't talk about it anymore because I'm like, I'm like, like am I yeah, so I just like I like how you owned it. You're like, yeah, like I'm very proud of this, and you're still very proud of it, right? Whereas like I don't even talk about that anymore because I'm like, oh, like someone they probably heard it before, you know?
Yeah. I like to normalize people's experience. Like you're not as different as you think you are. Just listen to me.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Aw. Yeah, that's beautiful. And so this is interesting. You you're able to because I do think especially in enterprise sales, like people are very, very competitive or there's a lot of hours, like deadlines, a lot of at stake in terms of like potentially winning pretty big deals that could make a huge difference in making a dent in the mortgage. How do you recommend folks think about their energy levels in terms of like, hey, like I feel like now that I'm more hybrid or working remotely, I want to make time to go to the gym, but I feel guilty. That's like
Hmm.
probably shouldn't be going to the gym during 9 to 5 work hours.
Yeah.
Love,
I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer something differently as well. This is where earlier you asked me, do I still feel imposter syndrome? And yes, I feel imposter syndrome because I'm still in growth phases. But now I see it as, yes, I feel this imposter syndrome and I don't make it mean anything about myself. But I want to just comment on the energy piece of sometimes I I like notice like, oh man, I'm feeling like a fraud right now. And then I ask myself, like, do I want to grow right now? Like, is this a good
mm,
time? Am I forcing myself to grow even though actually I shouldn't be growing? Or like,
mm,
is this something that I want to choose? Like I'm ready to do it. And in those times where
mm,
I'm like, yeah, like I'm ready, like I'm game, let's do this. Then when I feel that imposter syndrome, I see it as, oh, I'm in my sweet spot. Like I'm somebody who loves to learn and grow and develop. And this imposter
mm,
syndrome is not a sign that I'm not cut out for it. It's a sign that I'm right in my sweet spot. And I
mm,
think about it a lot like muscle growth. So
Mm,
if you go try a new workout, afterwards, probably your muscles are going to be super sore. And you're going to feel muscles. Sorry, there's a gnat. You're going to feel muscles that you haven't felt before that you didn't know existed. But what's
yeah.
interesting is when we feel muscle soreness, we think to ourselves, like, oh, that workout worked, right? I
Mm,
feel this discomfort, and it's a
mm,
sign that the work that I put in to grow is working. And I wish
mm,
we did the same thing for our mental growth. To me, it's the exact same thing. Imposter syndrome is just like sore muscles. Imposter syndrome is discomfort that is evidence that the mental growth you're putting in is working. And I wish that instead
mm.
of we looking at it as like, oh, I'm not cut out for this, I'm not good enough for this, I'm not going to be good enough for this. I wish we saw it as like, it's working. Cool. Like I'm
Huh.
growing.
Okay. Well, that's great. I'm glad we had this conversation because honestly, this is the year I've felt the most imposter syndrome, probably.
Yes. Right.
So
No, I mean, when you go
that's
out on
great.
your own, it's like, it's only you. You feel imposter syndrome all the time. You're learning so many new skills, which is like really fun. And sometimes
Hmm.
gets kind of old of like, man, I just wish I felt comfortable at this. But that's where like I still feel imposter syndrome all the time. And so then I just check in with myself like, do I want to grow right now? Is this a good time for me to grow?
Mm,
And if it is, then like, okay, I'm in my sweet spot. This
mm,
doesn't have to mean anything about me. And so I think of it as like the analogy that I always think of is um imposter syndrome usually is like for me it's a prom dress. It's usually like swimming in a prom dress. Or for a dude, it might be like a full tux with like a top hat and shoes and everything. And like
mm,
the effort that you have to put in to sell is not easy. It's not like you can just coast. And swimming is not easy. It's not like you can just coast. But it's like you're swimming with all this extra drag on you.
mm.
Like you're swimming with all this heavy stuff that doesn't
Oh,
isn't necessary. It doesn't need to be there. And so I think about when you reframe the way that you think about imposter syndrome, it's like taking off all those extra clothes and just swimming in a swimsuit.
wow.
Like
That's
it's still going to be kind of challenging, but it's not going to be as challenging as like you're making it right now.
that's for all you coaching nerds, that's one of the core competencies in when you try to get your MCC, the Masters in Coaching certification. So Amber's really good at doing analogies, and if you're like masterful at analogies, you score way higher on the. So I sorry, I was just nerding out at that. I was like,
Good to
man,
know. Good to
you're
know.
good at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I like how you're able to reframe, like, I think what you do best at, I mean, you're good at a lot of different things, but I like if it's because I now it's coming back to me, I'm like, oh yeah, she was always really good at like helping me reframe like this thing that I thought was like a negative thing or what whether it's coming from survival, but then able to see like the gold in it. So can you
Hmm.
walk us through how you were able to reframe the imposter syndrome? As most people would say that's a bad thing. It's like, oh, I feel very
Hmm.
uncomfortable, I feel out of place. And but you were able to say like, oh, it's I'm in my sweet spot. Like
Hmm.
that takes a while to get to that stage. So I'm
Oh
curious
yeah.
the framework.
It took years, I think. I mean, so the kind of like my path that I've been on is around 2014 is when I was working for that startup and felt like a complete fraud and just felt resigned of like, I guess I'm just not a confident person. I guess I'll just never be that kind of a person.
Hmm.
And then 2018 is when I went to coach school and I learned tools that what you think is creating your feelings. It's not your outside circumstance that's creating your feelings. It's not the fact that you work at a startup and people around you have Ivy League degrees that's creating your
Hmm.
feeling of imposter syndrome. It's your thought, like the meaning that you assign to that
Hmm.
of like, I'm not good enough, that's causing the feeling of feeling like a fraud. And so once I learned that it wasn't actually the outside circumstance, it was my thoughts. I was like, wait, I could
Hmm.
just change my thoughts and feel however I want. And I do feel like I went hard on that. And I then later learned like in 80% of the cases, I think it works. But if there's any trauma
Hmm.
involved or any like
Uh,
limiting beliefs from the past, like it's not as easy as it sounds, which is
hmm.
fine. And you can go find a qualified therapist who can help you through that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, once I learned that it was just your thoughts, I was like, wait a minute, this is kind of cool. And then I learned more about imposter syndrome, learned about those three different flavors. There's a really good TED talk. I think her name is Valerie Young, and she has a TED talk all about imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't until I kept hearing the story over and over and over from my clients that it really started to formulate for me. But I was like, there's
Mm,
a pattern here. I can see this pattern. And suddenly I was like, wait a minute. It's growth.
mhm,
Imposter syndrome is growth. Like that's what people don't talk
mm,
about. And I appreciate that there's such a conversation now about imposter syndrome, but people aren't talking about what to do about it or how to reframe it or
mm,
how to get around it. They just are like normalizing the imposter syndrome. But if
mm.
you stop there, then you're just kind of stuck with this
Huh.
weight that you're carrying around, not knowing what to do about it.
And you went through, was it the Brooke Castilla's
Yeah.
coaching school? Okay.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, she was for context, like she was like one of the first coaching podcasts I've ever listened to. I think
Yeah.
it just showed up on, it was like recommended on my Spotify or Stitcher, whatever, one of the
Yeah.
podcasting apps. And then I think you're probably the first person I know that went through the school. So clearly, like, so would you say that school taught you more about coaching or the business of coaching, or was it both, a little bit of both?
So it's really funny. So my corporate background is all over the place. I started out at a nonprofit as a receptionist. I graduated college in 2008, which, if you remember, was not a great time to be graduating college.
Oh yeah, yeah,
There's like a
it's
little bit of
crazy.
a market crash around that time.
Yeah, it's
So
so
I
crazy.
started as a receptionist and I was bored out of my mind and they implemented salesforce.com. And so I watched every tutorial I could and became a certified system administrator for salesforce.com. So then I went and did that. I became a scrum master. I did agile trainings. I moved into leadership development and learning and development. And it was funny because at one point I was doing like leadership trainings for new managers, like teaching them how to give good feedback, teaching them how to delegate. And I loved
Huh.
it whenever people would pull me aside and say, like, okay, but what should I do about this situation? I was like, this is the best. I love
Huh.
talking to you one on one. Like, let's
Okay.
talk next week after the training and like tell me how it goes. And I
Huh.
took an assessment that I love. It's called the Standout Assessment.
Oh
It's
yeah.
designed by Marcus Buckingham, and he was on the team that did the Strengths Finder assessment, if you've heard of that
Mm,
one. So it's kind of
yeah.
like Strengths Finder version two, but it makes
Yeah.
it a lot more actionable. It tells you what your strengths are. And I took that assessment when I was at the startup and they were going through rounds of layoffs. And it said that I would do really well as a career coach. And I was like, wait, you can get paid to do this? Like,
Mm,
this is amazing. This is my favorite part about any training that I do, just working one on one with people. And so I knew
mm,
I wanted to be a coach. And then I ended up, same thing. I saw Brooke Castillo's podcast. And I remember thinking, so hers is called the Life Coach School. And I remember thinking, well, I don't want to be a life coach. That doesn't sound appealing to me, but like it sounds like she knows how to build a business. And so I signed up
huh.
for the training, hoping to learn all about how to build a coaching business. And they were like, all we're focusing on is the content. I was like,
Um,
no, teach me how to build a website.
huh.
But it was good content. It's been helpful. And her content is just, it's essentially cognitive behavioral therapy. It's
Okay.
looking at your thoughts, it's changing your thoughts, changing the way you think about things so that you can feel better. And then she teaches the cycle of your thoughts create your feelings, and your feelings create the action that you do. Depending on how you're
Mm,
feeling, if you're feeling super motivated and pumped up, you take great action. If you're feeling really overwhelmed or down, then you procrastinate, you don't take any
mm,
action. And the action that you take is what gets you the results that you have. So it's a really
mm,
interesting model of just looking at what are the thoughts that you're putting in your brain and what are the thoughts that are just swirling around there. And there's another coach, Kara Lowenthal. She talks about how your brain is kind of like a drunk cockatoo. It's just repeating things that it hears.
mm,
There's no like rhyme or reason to it. It just like
mm.
has all these things that it's like, oh yeah, and don't forget about buying eggs. Like there's all this like,
Huh.
oh, and you aren't worth anything because I learned that when I was 6. Like there's just all this stuff that's getting
Mm,
repeated in your brain. So it is really helpful to examine like what is floating around in there and what do I want to intentionally decide to think. Are the
wow.
thoughts that are just randomly getting shot out by this cockatoo helpful? Or is
Mm.
there something else that I can choose to think that's going to be more helpful for me?
I, I feel like you're also really good at these super memorable, like, I hate to say one-liners, right? These little like
Yeah.
snippets that I'm always
Yeah.
like now I'm never gonna forget the
Right.
drunken cockatoo. I'm like, oh, I'm doing that drunken cockatoo thing, and I'm like, okay, like
Yes.
what? Like, let me choose a different story that's like more empowering.
Right.
That's awesome. Wow. So all right. So this is So you're clearly good at like you like learning, right? You've always been good at learning, with the Agile, with the Scrum Master, the Salesforce Administrator, like all that
Hmm.
stuff, right? So like how does someone get because I do think honestly like people stop aren't like you and I that are like always trying to learn, trying to read like self-development books like every, month reading a new book, right? How does someone get to a place where like because I think a lot of it's unconscious. I think people are just like, all right, well, I'm just gonna doom scroll because it's like the path of least resistance, right? And
Hmm.
then they wake up and they're like, I just did 5 hours of TikTok, right?
Yeah.
So how does someone get from like maybe that stage to like a point where like maybe they're just reading a one book every 3 months, right? I think a lot of my friends, they're like, man, I haven't read a book in like a year, you
Yeah.
know?
I mean, I think it's really interesting because I keep talking to people like I just met a new friend and he was like, I didn't know that I was dyslexic until I was an adult. And he's like, I just always thought I was stupid. And he's like, but now I found audiobooks and I
Mm,
listen to audiobooks nonstop. So
yeah.
I think a big part of it is just figuring out like how you learn information the best. My big thing with all of my clients is like, I want to help you figure out what is unique to you and how you work best. And so I think that's the first
Mm,
step. Like, if you have this, here's the thing, we all have shoulds in our head of like, I should want to read nonfiction instead of fiction,
mm,
or I should read 100 books a year because that's what other people are doing, or I should read like first thing in the
mm,
morning, read a few pages. And I think you just have to drop all the shoulds and instead just like move towards what you're drawn to. If you are
mm,
drawn to like, I want to do more self-help kind of books, then like figure out like what is the best way for you to do that. Maybe it's something like, is it called Blinkist? Those
oh
like
yeah. Yeah.
summary. Maybe it's something where it's like there's so many companies out there that do these summaries and you can
Mm,
listen to it or you can read it in 15 minutes and get a summary. And especially for nonfiction books, like most, like we've read a bunch of these. There's a lot that you're like, this could have been a blog post. Like
mm,
this didn't have to be a whole book. There's a lot of fluff in here. It could have been a blog post. So maybe you get
yeah.
everything that you need out of one of those summaries. Or maybe it's that you do much better listening to a book than
Mm,
actually reading it. Or maybe it's that like I'm reading a book right now by Arthur Brooks and Oprah. It's called Build a Better Life. And I was
mm,
listening to the audiobook just in the car, and then I heard him interviewed on a podcast. And in the podcast that was like an hour and a half long, he basically covered the whole book.
yeah.
So like maybe instead of reading the whole book, maybe listening to them in an interview is what you need. Or here's another trick I learned recently. You can get the audiobook, and especially if you do like Audible plus Kindle, since they're both Amazon products, you can get the audiobook and the ebook, and you can like read it as you listen to it, and
Oh
you can go through
yeah.
it super,
Yeah.
super fast. So
Yeah.
I think like if you are the kind of person that you're like, man, I wish I was reading more, that's something that you're drawn to. Now you just have to figure out like what's the easiest way for me to do that. And I'm going to try to not judge myself as I go through
Mm.
this because all the judgment just makes you a lot less likely to do it.
Hmm. That's awesome. This I feel like yeah, I would love to do this more often because you're always
Yeah.
dropping so many gems. Like this is amazing.
Thank
Um,
you.
so clearly, so you're working, yeah, so we covered a lot. So let me just kind of unpack and just digest everything because I felt like there was a lot of like valuable content. So what I'm hearing is the three steps is well like the just got lucky part definitely resonates because I do hear that a lot, right? Like a lot of like I call them humble high achievers. Like it's like, oh,
Mm,
I just got let's like I'm like, oh, like how'd you become manager at LinkedIn, one of the best, like how'd you win manager of the year? It's like, oh, I got lucky, I had a good
yeah.
boss and like blah blah blah. And it's like, so this is a common theme. I like how you said like normalizing it. I think in some ways, yes, I do think imposter syndrome is a bit more normalized now, but it what I thought was super interesting what you said about the self-esteem part, where if this is a reoccurring thing that's like happening a lot versus the imposter syndrome is more of like, hey, this is just a temporary thing as you're putting yourself into like a new position, a promotion, you're being a manager for the first time. So I thought that was interesting. And then making a list of your accomplishments that's great. I
Hmm.
I think not many of us do that. And especially now that we're older, right? Maybe when you're like a kid and you're like 8 and then your parents are like, hey, like, or your teacher's like, do this exercise. But I think the older we get, we don't give ourselves enough credit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and especially like if you're like a mom as well, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're like a stay-at-home mom, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure like you're not like, hey, like today I was a good mother, right? Usually it's the opposite. It's
I
like,
know.
oh, I
I
would
told my
it's
husband when we had our first kid, I was like, there's no performance reviews.
hmm,
I get no
yeah.
feedback. There's no like, hey, mom, you
Hmm,
really crushed that diaper. Like, you did a phenomenal job. You took the feedback I gave you. Like, there's no feedback. I was like, this is really
hmm.
difficult.
That's interesting. So because you don't get feedback, it's I do notice that like now I tell my mom she's an awesome mom, right? But this is like 21 years later than I should have given
Yeah.
her that feedback.
Right.
So if she doesn't have like if she doesn't have people like her son or her daughter telling her like, hey, like, thanks for being an awesome mom, like how does one go about doing that for themselves as a mother?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest like pitfalls that anybody can fall into is comparison. Comparing yourself to other people, and especially in the world of moms, like you might be comparing yourself to an Instagram version of somebody else's
Hmm.
momming, and you
Yeah.
don't see the whole picture and you don't see what they feel behind the scenes. And
Hmm.
so I think a really easy way to kind of try to get around that is just focusing on your personal best. And to be honest with you, one thing for me that was really helpful as like a perfectionist, or recovering perfectionist was in my parenting, I was like, I'm just aiming for B minus. I'm not aiming for A
Oh,
plus. I'm aiming for B
yeah.
minus. I'm not going to be amazing, and that's okay. And I'm just going to like do what's important to me. And like some things are going to fall by the wayside. Like before I had kids, I
Oh,
thought my kids would never eat McDonald's. That's the most disgusting, like toxic food they could ever have. And
oh.
then like, okay, yep, my kids eat McDonald's. But like I have like my core values of like these are the things that are not going to change. And then like, okay,
Hmm.
I can probably give myself some leeway on some of the other things.
That's amazing. The possibility of being a B plus or B minus like person
Yeah.
once in a while, like that's
Right.
okay.
Yeah, like what if that's what you're
Yeah.
aiming towards? Like, okay, some things are going to not be perfect and
Oh,
that's all right.
that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Amber. What's the best way people can get in touch with you? Oh, I'll include your socials, your website, and your LinkedIn. But
Yeah.
what's the best way? Like, how have people been reaching out to you more recently?
Yeah, the best way to find me is LinkedIn. Just come search for me, Amber Dibert. And if you want to learn any more information about me, you can go check out my website, mentalmastery.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Amber. I just want to acknowledge you for being an awesome parent, wife, friend, coach, mentor, and yeah, just for the positivity, the lightness, the radiance, the warmth, and just you're able to do all these amazing analogies that will definitely stick in my head for for the rest of my life,
I
probably.
appreciate it.
And just for the amazing impact that you have with like every single human being you come across.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Davidson. Thanks for having me.
Yay.